They expected pain. They expected hate. But what awaited them was mercy. When a group of wounded Japanese prisoners were brought to an Allied field hospital, they braced for humiliation. Whispers of torture filled their minds. They had been taught that capture meant dishonor, and compassion from the enemy was a myth. Yet, as the white curtains opened, gentle hands reached out, not to strike, but to heal. The nurses spoke softly, their faces calm beneath the roar of distant guns. Blood was cleaned, wounds were wrapped, and for the first time, the prisoners saw eyes that did not burn with anger. In that silent room, where war's noise faded into the hum of life returning, the men realized something more powerful than victory or defeat, that even in war, kindness could break through steel and hatred alike. War was supposed to strip men of their humanity, to turn hearts into weapons and compassion into weakness. For the Japanese soldiers captured in the Pacific, that belief was carved deep into their souls. They had been told that surrender meant shame, and the enemy would treat them like animals. When they were finally taken as prisoners, they expected cruelty, starvation, and endless humiliation. But what they found defied everything they had been taught. In a small Allied field hospital, surrounded by tents, blood, and silence, they encountered nurses who did not see enemies, only men in pain. These women had seen too much death to create more of it. Instead, they chose to heal. Bandages replaced bullets, and the smell of medicine replaced gunpowder. For the first time since the war began, these broken soldiers felt something unfamiliar: kindness. The jungle was no longer alive. Smoke drifted through shattered trees, and the air stank of gunpowder and fear. For days, the Japanese soldiers had fought with the desperation of men who knew that capture was worse than death. Their commanders had told them, "Never surrender. The enemy will show no mercy." But hunger had a way of defeating even the strongest loyalty. Their uniforms hung loose on their bodies, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. When the Allied troops surrounded them, rifles aimed and voices shouting, they dropped their weapons with trembling hands. There was no glory left, only exhaustion. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Some soldiers knelt, others stared blankly at the mud beneath them. They expected to be shot on the spot, or dragged to some unknown camp where punishment awaited. But instead, they were given water, clear, cold, and undeserved. One of them, a young private, hesitated before drinking, unsure if it was a trick. But when he finally sipped, tears filled his eyes. It was the first taste of mercy he had ever known from an enemy. The march to the POW camp was long and brutal. The prisoners were weak, many wounded, and all broken inside. They carried not just their injuries, but the unbearable weight of shame. In their culture, capture was dishonor, a fate worse than death. They walked in silence, haunted by memories of brothers who had chosen suicide rather than surrender. Every step felt like a betrayal. One soldier whispered, "We are ghosts now. Japan will forget us." No one answered. The only sound was the shuffle of boots and the distant rumble of trucks carrying the victors away. When they arrived at the camp, they were stripped of their belongings, their swords, their flags, even the small tokens they carried from home. What remained was their humanity, though most no longer believed they still had any. The guards watched them closely, but there was no hatred in their eyes, only caution, and a strange weariness shared by men who had all seen too much. At night, the Japanese POWs huddled together under the dim light of lanterns. Some prayed, others stared at the stars through the barbed wire. A few whispered about the strange rumors, that wounded prisoners were being taken to a nearby Allied hospital. They didn't believe it. To them, such mercy was impossible. One soldier, his arm infected and trembling, muttered, "They will finish us there. That is what hospitals are for, to end what the battlefield could not." The others nodded. No one dared to hope. And yet, deep within the silence of that camp, something began to stir, a quiet shift in fate. Because the next morning, trucks would arrive, and among the prisoners chosen for transport would be those whose lives were about to be changed forever. Not by cruelty, not by vengeance, but by kindness no soldier could have imagined. The morning the trucks arrived, the prisoners were half awake, their bodies sore from the cold ground. A thin fog hung over the camp, blurring the world into shades of gray. When their names were called, they assumed this was the end, a silent convoy taking them to another prison or perhaps to face the firing line. None dared to ask questions. Silence had become their shield. The trucks rattled for hours through battered roads and the ruins of villages. Every sound of the engine made hearts tighten. When they finally stopped, the men saw a cluster of white tents and the faint red cross painted on their sides. For a moment, confusion replaced fear. A hospital, one whispered. It felt like mockery, a place of healing in the middle of war. They were led inside, weak and staggering. The air smelled of alcohol, smoke, and medicine, a scent unfamiliar to those who had spent years surrounded by rot and blood. And then, through the haze, they saw them, the nurses. Women in white uniforms, moving quickly but gently, voices calm yet firm. Their faces were young, tired, but steady. The prisoners froze. They could not comprehend what they were seeing. One nurse approached with a bowl of water and a cloth. She knelt beside a man whose leg was wrapped in a dirty bandage crawling with flies. Without a word, she began cleaning it. The soldier flinched, expecting pain, maybe mockery. Instead, her touch was steady, deliberate. He watched her eyes, they carried no hatred, only focus. The room was filled with murmurs. The wounded Japanese stared in disbelief as the nurses worked, washing blood from enemy flesh as if it were their duty, as if the war outside didn't matter inside these walls. A tall nurse named Margaret moved from bed to bed, her uniform stained with dust. She spoke softly to a British medic. "Treat them all the same," she said. "No exceptions." The medic hesitated. "Even them?" She looked at him, her voice low but unyielding. "Especially them. If we lose our humanity now, we've already lost the war." Her words echoed through the tent, though most of the prisoners couldn't understand English. Still, they felt the tone, the warmth, the authority, the defiance of cruelty. Days passed, and the hospital became a strange island of peace in the middle of chaos. Outside, artillery thundered. Inside, only whispers and the sound of bandages unrolling. The Japanese prisoners watched as nurses changed dressings, shared rations, even offered water from their own cups. One evening, a young nurse named Evelyn found an elderly soldier trying to hide his infection, ashamed of the smell. She knelt, took his trembling hand, and said softly, "You're safe here." He didn't understand the words, but her tone pierced through the wall of language and culture. His eyes filled with tears he had been taught never to shed. The prisoners began to change. Suspicion gave way to silence, then to reluctant gratitude. One man bowed his head every time a nurse passed. Another, whose arm had been saved from amputation, whispered to his comrades, "They fight with mercy, not with guns." Even the guards began to notice the shift. The camp doctor, a weary captain who had seen too much death, wrote in his journal, "I watched a Japanese soldier smile today for the first time. The nurses have achieved what our weapons never could, peace." In the evenings, when the nurses rested under lantern light, they spoke of what they had seen, the fear in those men's eyes, the confusion that slowly melted into trust. "They look at us like ghosts," one said. "As if they can't believe we're real." Outside, the sky turned red with the reflection of distant fires. Yet within that hospital, something pure endured, a quiet rebellion against hatred itself. The nurses did not wear medals, nor did they expect praise. But in their hands, the war softened, if only for a moment. For the prisoners, that moment was everything. They came expecting pain, and instead found the most powerful weapon of all, compassion. It didn't just heal their wounds, it rewrote their understanding of humanity. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital that once felt like a dream began to resemble something sacred. The Japanese prisoners, still uncertain of their fate, began to observe the nurses closely. They noticed the way the women treated every patient the same, no difference between an Allied soldier or a captured enemy. It was as if, within those white tents, the rules of war had been erased. For many of the POWs, this kindness was harder to bear than pain. They had been taught since childhood that mercy from the enemy was weakness, that compassion was a tool of deception. But here, every bandage and every smile challenged that belief. They found themselves caught between two worlds, the one they had been raised in, and the one they were now witnessing. One evening, a nurse named Margaret entered a dim tent where a soldier named Saito lay pale and feverish. His body shook under the thin blanket, his wounds festering from infection. When she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, his voice trembled in broken English. Why you help me?" She paused, surprised by his effort to speak. "Because you're hurt," she replied softly. His eyes filled with tears. "Enemy, me enemy." Margaret smiled faintly. Pain doesn't choose sides. He turned his head away, but that night, he didn't close his eyes to die. For the first time since his capture, he closed them to rest. Across the ward, another nurse, Evelyn, read aloud from a Bible to a young Allied soldier missing his leg. Nearby, two Japanese prisoners listened silently. They couldn't understand the words, but the melody in her voice was calm, almost holy. One of the men whispered, "Maybe she prays for all." Small acts began to weave invisible threads between those who had been enemies. One morning, a Japanese soldier who had recovered enough to walk insisted on helping carry water. The nurses allowed it. Later, when food supplies ran short, another prisoner offered his ration to a wounded American. The guards looked on, astonished. The hatred that had once defined both sides was quietly dissolving, replaced by something neither could name. The camp doctor wrote in his notes, "War strips men of their souls. But here, these women give them back." In the corner of the hospital, a group of nurses worked through the night stitching torn uniforms, replacing them with clean linen robes. It was a small gesture, but for the prisoners, it meant dignity. One soldier looked at his clean bandages and whispered a prayer in Japanese, not to his emperor, but to the God he imagined these women served. Rumors began spreading among the prisoners who had not yet been treated. They spoke of angels in white, of hands that healed instead of harmed. Some thought it propaganda. Others said it was proof that even in war, humanity could survive. But for those who had felt those gentle hands, it was no myth. They began to see their captors not as monsters, but as people. And more painfully, they began to see themselves, the things they had done, the lives they had taken, through the eyes of those who forgave without words. One nurse wrote in her diary, "They thank us with their silence. Sometimes with tears. Sometimes with small bows that break my heart. I used to hate them for what they did to our soldiers, but when you hold a dying man's hand, hate seems too heavy to carry." The hospital became a strange kind of sanctuary, surrounded by chaos, yet untouched by it. Outside, the war still raged. Planes flew overhead, bombs fell in distant towns, and the ground trembled from artillery fire. But inside those tents, the only sound was the heartbeat of mercy. By the time new orders came for the prisoners to be transferred, many of them could barely speak from emotion. They tried to bow, to express gratitude, but words failed. For men who had been trained to see kindness as weakness, this experience became a wound of its own, one that never fully healed. Because the nurses had done more than save their bodies. They had restored something far rarer, faith in the possibility of forgiveness. When the war finally began to fade into whispers, the prisoners who had survived the hospital found themselves in a strange silence. The guns had stopped, but inside, the echoes remained. For many of them, the memory of that field hospital, the women in white, the soft voices, the scent of medicine, became something they could never erase. Weeks later, the Japanese prisoners were transferred to another camp, this time under less strain, with better food and care. One evening, a British officer entered the barracks holding a small bundle of paper. "You may write home," he announced. "The war is over." The men stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. Write home? To whom? Many had no families left. Others believed Japan would never accept them, that their surrender made them ghosts in the eyes of their homeland. But as the officer left the papers behind, something inside them stirred. One by one, they began to write. The pencils trembled in their hands, the words came slow, uncertain. What could they possibly say after everything they had done and seen? Some started with apologies. Others simply wrote about the nurses. "I was wounded," one letter began, "and the enemy healed me." Another, "They washed my blood as if I was their brother." And another, "If you ever doubt that mercy exists, remember that it was found in the hands of those we were taught to hate." Those letters would never make it to every family, many were intercepted, lost, or destroyed. But the few that did reach Japan became quiet testaments to something beyond propaganda, beyond war. Families wept as they read them, not out of shame, but relief. Their sons were still human. One man, Sergeant Tanaka, wrote to his mother, "I could not die with honor, but perhaps I lived with grace. The nurses treated my wounds and my soul. When they smiled, I remembered your face. Tell the children that kindness is stronger than hate." The Allied nurses, unaware of these letters, continued their work long after the prisoners left. Yet they, too, carried invisible letters in their hearts, memories of faces that haunted them in quiet hours. Margaret would later say to Evelyn, "We never cured the war, but maybe we cured something inside it." Years passed. Some of the former POWs returned to Japan and lived quiet lives, never speaking of their imprisonment. But in old journals discovered decades later, historians found fragments, brief notes, sketches of nurses, drawings of white tents under gray skies. One read simply, "They made me believe in the world again." Those few words carried more power than any victory speech. When one Allied nurse was interviewed in her later years, she said, "People always ask how I could treat them after what they did. I tell them, if we only heal those we love, we've learned nothing from war." The letters, both written and unwritten, became symbols of something the battlefield could not destroy, the fragile bridge between enemies. And as history moved on, buried under monuments and medals, those letters whispered from the past. That sometimes, the greatest act of defiance in war is not to fight, but to care. Long after the smoke of war had cleared and the world began rebuilding what it had destroyed, the story of those nurses and the Japanese prisoners faded quietly into history. No medals were given. No speeches were made. Yet, their actions echoed far louder than gunfire ever could. For the men who had once believed that honor was found only in death, those days in the hospital redefined everything. They learned that true strength was not the ability to kill, but the courage to forgive, and to accept forgiveness. The memory of gentle hands cleaning their wounds haunted them far more deeply than any battlefield. Many of them never spoke of it again. But in their hearts, they carried a different kind of scar, one that reminded them that humanity could survive even the darkest madness. The war had tried to erase compassion, yet within those tents, it had been reborn. For the nurses, their kindness was never about politics or victory. It was about something far greater, the belief that life, no matter whose it was, deserved mercy. And so, long after the world moved on, their story remained, not written in history books, but in the quiet gratitude of the men they healed. Because in a world torn apart by hate, they proved that the smallest act of compassion can become the loudest echo of peace.